Welcome back, guys. Time to talk training, prime tanker training. And this is maybe not going to be what you think. It's kind of some thoughts on what you should consider for tanker training. If you're coming to prime, I think the number one thing you have to remember in terms of prime tanker and training is you have to remember that Prime has about 5,000 refrigerated trucks, reefer trucks out there. They have about another 1,000 trucks that are flatbed. And then you get to the tanker division. And there are a grand total of lease operators, company drivers, over the road, regional dedicated tanker drivers of about 250 tanker drivers at Prime. When you consider that, and that not all tanker drivers are trainers, not all reefer drivers are trainers either, not all flatbed drivers are trainers or instructors, and there is a difference between an instructor and a trainer. There are a handful at best of instructors and trainers within the tanker division, and that is very important to remember for a number of reasons. Let's start with PSD. First of all, I don't want to get into exactly how Prime's training program works. There's a lot of information on the internet. If you're here watching my videos, I'm sure you've done other research. You've looked at forums, you've looked at websites, you've watched other YouTube videos about how Prime's training works. I'm sure you've heard of the PSD Prime Student Driver Program. If you haven't, that is the CDL training program where you get your Class A CDL through Prime. And then after you finish that, there is the TNT portion, trainer and trainee portion of the program. And like I said, I don't want to go through, here's how much you make, here's how long each one takes, all that stuff. Like I said, there's a lot of information about how Prime's training program works. What I want to talk about is how that relates to tanker at Prime. And the first thing, like I said, you have to remember, not a lot of tanker instructors and trainers. First of all, the difference between an instructor and a trainer is an instructor is someone who teaches people how to drive trucks. So they are PSD instructors. There are there's fewer PSD tanker instructors than there are even TNT trainers. So there's your difference. There's an instructor for PSD and a trainer for TNT. Pretty basic there. I was unbelievably lucky. During my orientation, during a class that they no longer actually offer during orientation, it was the pre-trip class. They used to on Wednesday mornings have a class, couple of hours, where they would go over in the classroom what the pre-trip was, all the components, and then they would take you out and show you on the truck. I guess now, as the change in the PSD program, when I went through, it was 4 weeks minimum. I think it was 60 hours required driving. Now the change is you have to be out for 14 days minimum before you come back to test. So I was out for about 4 weeks. Actually, I think it was 4.5 weeks by the time things were said and done. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But guy raised his hand, asked a question during the pre-trip class, said, hey, we don't have this particular component in tanker. My ears perked up. I went over and I introduced myself to that guy. He ended up being my PSD instructor. So I ended up in tanker, in PSD, and I have never driven another semi besides a Prime tanker. If you watch the previous video that I put up, the who, what, why video, I mentioned I've been with Prime for just about a year. I had school bus driving experience, charter bus driving experience before coming to Prime. That's the only large commercial motor vehicle experience that I had. A lot of people have asked, do you have to have experience? As far as I know, you do not. I do know other people who did have no previous driving experience, commercial motor vehicle driving experience, who have come into Prime and have started in the tank division. This is something that you will hear people say, and you will probably be frustrated by it, but I'm going to repeat it. Ask your recruiter. The reason that I say that is just because it's the case for one person doesn't make it the case for another person. And if your recruiter says you cannot join Tanker, there's probably a reason for it. It's not up to me. It's not up to you. It's up to Prime. And there may be a reason that you don't know about, that I don't know about. It may be geography. It may be something with your experience, your job history. So just very quickly, that's what I'll say on the experience. As far as I know, like I said, I know people who have not driven a commercial motor vehicle ever come to Prime and start in the tank division. Quickly on, if you are lucky like me and do your PSD in a tank, the law states you are not allowed to drive a loaded tanker. So be aware that while you're a PSD, you will only drive deadhead miles. And deadhead miles, if you're not aware, is after you're empty. So your instructor is going to drive once you're loaded to where you deliver, and then you will have the opportunity to drive after that, deadheading to either a tank wash, to your next pickup location, things along those lines. That is a FMCSA, Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. That is a law. That is not a Prime policy. So be aware of that. And as a consequence of that, that may limit, and that's one of the reasons that it took me 4.5 weeks instead of 4 weeks to come back and take my CDL test. So that's point number one. Point number two in the PSD part, your job, PSD, is to learn to drive the truck. It's not to learn how to pump. It's not to learn how any of the paperwork works, how to work the Qualcomm, which is the computer in the truck. It's to learn to drive the truck. Because of the severely limited number of PSD instructors that we have in Tank Division, it may benefit you to go out with a refrigerated driver, reefer driver. Prime is very well aware that there are not enough instructors and trainers within the division. It is what it is. They are trying to get more guys to sign up to be trainers. It's not something that I'm really able to do because of doing the dedicated, having a lightweight truck. I don't have a second bunk. I'm not going to invite guys to come back and live in my house. So it's just it's part of the nature of the beast. It's a problem that Prime has. So that's what I want to say about PSD. TNT, once you get your CDL, so what will happen is you'll finish up the PSD portion. You'll go back and take your over-the-road test, your pre-trip test, your backing test. Somebody asked me about backing, and does Tanker back? Absolutely, we back, and we back. And I don't want to denigrate box trucks, reefers, and dry vans, but we back into anything and everything, and places that aren't designed to have trucks go into them. We'll back over railroad tracks and into some tight spaces that probably were designed in the 40s and 50s to have smaller trucks back into them. So we go into some funky places, and I appreciate the gentleman who wrote in that question, and in fact it inspired me. That is going to be a video, because there's actually, I can get quite detailed into backing. We have shorter trailers than, we're 48 feet long, refrigerated is 53 feet. Don't want to get quite that far, but we'll do a video on that later on. TNT, that is when you learn everything else. You are a truck driver. You're basically an apprentice truck driver at that point, but you have your commercial driver's license, Class A. You're learning everything else about how that truck runs on a daily basis. How to do your paperwork, how to do your logs. You probably won't do your logs. You won't touch your logs while you're a PSD, because your job is to learn to drive the truck, how to shift, do all those things. You do have to double clutch in PSD. You'll be able to learn to float if you're interested in doing that when you're in TNT. But during TNT, you learn how to pump. You'll learn how to handle the receivers, go in and talk to them. And to some extent, when you're in PSD, the reason for that you don't do any of that is, first of all, they want you to concentrate on learning to drive the truck and pass the test. But you're also not a prime employee at that point. And there's liability, and they don't want somebody to climb up on the ladder, fall off. Then you have somebody who is not an employee getting injured or things along those lines. So keep that in mind. TNT, like I said, you get to learn everything else. It's on-the-job training, so that when you finish up your 30,000 miles TNT in a tank truck, you'll go to your upgrade process. And that's what it's called, is you go back to Springfield or Pittston. I don't think I've ever heard of anyone going to Salt Lake City to upgrade, at least in tanker. But you'll go to one of those two and you'll upgrade. And the reason they call it upgrade is Prime has, if you've already received your letter saying congratulations, you've been invited to Prime orientation as a D seat, you progress through the system, D seat, C seat, B seat. And then eventually when you upgrade, you become an A seat driver, which is a full-time driver with Prime, with your own truck. So the upgrade process is they upgrade your file, you have to do some more computer-based testing. You have to go back on the simulator. Go through insurance class if you want to sign up for insurance, if you're going company, things like that. And then you get to pick out your truck if you're leasing, or you get assigned a truck if you are a company driver. And then for tanker, there is boot camp. Boot camp is basically a final exam. Takes 2 days. They make sure, basically, there's a guy, his name is Jeff Bruton. He takes a tank out. They've got a tank full of water. You got a trailer. Hook up the trailer and the tank full of water. You pump between the two. He pretty much lets you do it and make sure you're doing it the correct way. He'll make suggestions, but you go through that process. There's some more videos you have to watch that are tanker specific, but that's the upgrade process. There is a written test at the end of that. But that's what boot camp is all about. It's really pretty simple. If you learned everything you needed to learn during your TNT phase, boot camp's certainly nothing to be afraid of, because you'll have known it. There's probably one thing specifically that you learn, and that is how to rebuild a pump. There's seals inside the pump that sometimes leak. You need to know how to change those. But that's it. My biggest piece of advice, and I know this video is running a little long, and I do apologize for that. Be your own advocate. I mentioned the fact that there's not a lot of PSD instructors, even less than there are TNT trainers within the tank division. You may have to start in a refrigerated truck. If you want to move over to the tank division, you need to be your own advocate. There are 5,000 refrigerated trucks out there. A lot of them have PSD and TNT students. If you at the beginning say, hey, I want to go to tanker division, and then never say anything about it again, they're going to assume that you like what you're doing in reefer and are going to keep you there. If you keep mentioning it, and you're supposed to call in once a week while you're in training, both in PSD and TNT, and you talk to your instructor or trainer's fleet manager, and you just, it's a very casual conversation. How are things going? Are you learning what you need to learn? Is this progressing the right way? Be your own advocate. If you want to be in the tanker division, make sure you have that conversation when you talk to your trainer's fleet manager, your instructor's fleet manager. Last point that I want to make, and again, this is kind of going back to something I said last video, the who, what, why video that I put out was about saving money. About 6 weeks before I left for Prime is when I made the final decision. Told Prime I will be there on January 12th of last year. My wife and I sat down at that time and did our budget. And we figured out how much money we needed. Now, remember, for me, it was 4 weeks of PSD. Plus, then you got to remember there's an additional week for your orientation. 5 weeks of not being paid. You can get an advance for the 4 weeks that you're PSD. Now, if you're starting now, you've got at least 2 weeks. Now, keep in mind, just because they say you have to stay out for a minimum of 14 days, if your instructor doesn't feel you're ready to come back and test 14 days after you leave, you're going to stay out on the road, because they're not going to bring you back knowing that you're not going to pass the test. So you have to figure at least 3 weeks without pay. Yes, they do advance you $200 a week. That's not including the orientation week. So 1 week for sure without pay, at least 2 weeks of maybe getting an advance. I would advise you do not take the advance. I did not take the advance. If you have to take the advance, that's fine. They will take it out in $25 increments over your paycheck once you're hired. You're hired once you get your CDL. For me, just so you know, 4 weeks worth of an advance. Because what happened, I should say, I didn't take it, but then I took it all at the end. We planned well, but there were a couple of things that popped up, so we did take the advance at the end. So I ended up taking $800 worth of an advance. It took about 5.5 months to pay that back at $25 a week. So keep that in mind, that that's an additional expense that they're going to keep dinging you for each week. If you can avoid taking it, I would advise doing so. And like I said, we were able to plan. We skimped for the 6 weeks before I left for Prime. And just through budgeting, we saved money so that I had money when I was out on the road. You'll also find that a lot of your instructors and trainers, first of all, they're making money while you're in the truck. They're getting paid to have you in the truck on the PSD side. The TNT side, their pay is that they can run a lot more miles, because you will run as a team truck when you're TNT. Be aware of that. There's some guys that aren't aware of the fact that you're going to run pretty much 24 hours a day, and you're probably going to be driving overnight. You're going to be sleeping while your instructor is your trainer is driving. So keep that in mind. And your trainer is going to be sleeping while you're driving. And that's going to happen pretty quick after you get your CDL. At any rate, this video is going very long. Thanks for sticking with me. If you have, that's what I have to say about tanker training. It's a lot. There's a lot there. If you have any more questions about training, I will try to answer them. Enjoy. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.